Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Associate Professor of Communication at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be talking about election forecasting. What is it and what makes it social? And my guests to discuss this are Professor Matthew Wall and Dr. Louis Bromfield, who are both at the Department of Politics, Philosophy, and International Relations at Swansea University in the UK. And Professor Wall and Dr. Bromfield are also podcast hosts and have their own forecasting platform called Horse Race Politics. And I joined their podcast in a two-part episode. I'll put a link down to that in the episode description. And if you're curious what my recording rig looks like, they do a video podcast and it's super cool. Very nice studio. So there's links to that and also to the forecasting platform that we'll talk more about towards the end of the episode. But you can join the platform and enter your own predictions about how elections will go. And there is a scoring system that you sort of accumulate points over the course of your forecasting, which brings us to gamification, which we'll also talk about in this episode and was the core focus of Dr. Bromfield's doctoral thesis, where he built a platform called Fantasy Forecast and gamified it to measure effects on political engagement. So in addition to discussing that towards the end of the episode, we'll talk about forecasting. In particular, we'll talk about prediction markets like Polymarket, which is kind of a social medium. It has profiles and comments, and I think the act of collectively forecasting and watching those markets move up and down could be considered a type of social medium. So we'll talk about Polymarket. We'll talk about the wisdom of the crowd. We'll talk about what makes a good individual super forecaster and the applications of forecasting in United States intelligence work, especially after 9/11, which is super interesting. And then we'll also look at how Professor Wall has used betting market odds in the context of research and building out statistical models. So it is a bit of a longer episode where we cover a lot of ground, but good crack, as they say. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Wall and Dr. Bromfield. Again, they are at the Department of Politics, Philosophy, and International Relations at Swansea University. Professor Wall, Dr. Bromfield, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So to start out here, why don't we set the stage with how scholars generally think about election forecasting? I mean, if we look at opinion polls, those are kind of a snapshot in time, but there's also this implication that they're a signal for how an election might go. So in your view, what is election forecasting and what are some of the key ways that it is currently done?
A two-parter. Which one do you want? Definition?
I can talk a little bit about the concept of it, because it's something actually that's more slippery than you might suspect. So at the most basic level, a forecast is some form of prediction about a future event, right? So it's defined by its relationship to time. Now, the nature of the prediction is where the slipperiness kind of comes in. So for example, if I said to you, maybe before the soccer match last night, Wales are going to beat England. I think Wales can do it. You know, now sitting here in the cold light of day with a 3-0 victory for England, you might say, well, you made a bad forecast. But if I'm clever, I might say, well, I just thought Wales had a chance.
Yeah.
So in the kind of more technical literature, so Philip Tetlock would be the person who's kind of pioneered, but I'd say both the technical and the conceptual literature. To be a proper forecast, there has to be like an assigned probability of an outcome. And to have an accountable forecast, you have to actually review post-outcome how well your prediction aligned with that outcome. But human beings don't like to admit that they were wrong. And a lot of forecasting is basically forcing people to specify probabilities for a future outcome, ultimately in a kind of quantitative sense. And we tend to use a percentage probability to do that. But the difficulty is people don't tend to think in probabilities, right? And so forecasters face this dilemma.
More like possibilities. They think about what could happen rather than how likely it could
happen. They think in narrative terms, really. Yeah. And so forecasters, when they're talking to a policymaker, face a dilemma of, if I say something is 95% certain, that's about as good as it gets, right? If you understand probabilistic statistics. But a policymaker might hear, well, there's a 5% chance this won't work. And we know in terms of the psychology of risk, people overestimate certain type of risks. And people like Tetlock sums up a lot of his research is people think in terms of this will never happen, this will definitely happen, and this might or might not happen.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that middle category actually contains everything, but people don't tend to grade very much. Yeah. So long story short, I think a real forecast is someone being forced to grade in a quite fine-grained way the probability of a future event, which is then evaluated post hoc.
Yes. And then when it comes to like the ways that which that can manifest, so I think Matt makes a really good point that a lot of forecasting can be done in a very casual sense. And for the most part, most forecasting is done in a very casual sense. Sport is probably the best comparison for this in terms of just how you talk about how things might happen. But also in election context as well. We had many conversations with colleagues leading up to the election where even they, as established academics, discuss it in terms of, well, I think this could happen. I actually think that Trump could win. Maybe you'd be surprised. This very casual language that doesn't really have any consequences to it. So what we see in kind of forecasting research and what Matt and I do is really trying to formalize that process so that there is kind of accountability at the end. But in terms of the forms that it can take, there are a plethora, but we in our kind of written work focus on three, which are polls, prediction models, and prediction markets. Your polls are your typical, you're getting called by some individual who'd like to ask you questions about how likely is it that you will vote, or if there were an election held tomorrow, how would you vote? And each of these, as you correctly point out, are snapshots of a moment in time that individually might be useful, but in the aggregate and over time, then really kind of tell a story about how people view what's going on. Okay, so at the moment, polls kind of dominate the headlines in the UK because our Labour government, who came in after 14 years of Conservative rule, have completely cacked their pants in terms of running the country, decided that targeting disabled people and elderly people were like the first two groups to go for. People didn't really like that. They haven't really changed. There's been a lot of sleaze. So all of a sudden, the perceptions of the Labour Party have just tanked, but polls tell that story.
Yeah,
right?
Just to say, I think we chatted to a colleague there, the polls are at the lowest approval rating for a prime minister at this point in their term in British polling history, albeit like Liz Truss probably would have if she'd last this long.
Yeah.
But so it's beyond a midterm slump.
No, but that's exactly the function that polls really serve. And what they should do is act as like a temperature check for whoever's in charge to say, you're getting this wrong. So Labour have tried to kind of reposition recently, and they've tried to be a little bit more to the left, but not massively, but recognizing the state of Palestine, for example. So that's polls. Prediction models can vary from like the simple to the absurdly complex. Realistically, a prediction model it could just be an aggregate of polls. I could just take 10 pollsters that I really like, and I could take whatever they're predicting and calculate the mean and do nothing else. And that's my model. Other models can be way more complex. They can have a load of kind of original statistical techniques that you add to it, where you weight different things more or less. Maybe an example of a simpler one would perhaps be Alan Lichtman's 13 Keys that we always love to talk about. We have a picture of Alan in our office of him looking extremely depressed after he got the Harris-Trump election wrong. His whole model is like, I have 13 different aspects about the country, and they're either good for the incumbent or they're not. But that's a prediction model, right? And then lastly, you've got prediction markets, which are basically just gambling, where you are placing a certain amount of money on what you think is going to happen, and it pays out if it happens, it doesn't pay out if it doesn't happen. But these probably operate at the biggest scale of all of them. So yeah, election forecasting takes all these different forms, but those are probably the three that you're most familiar with.
Yeah, and we've talked quite a bit on the show before about polls and prediction models. So what I'd like to ask you guys about is prediction markets. And in particular, I think with the last US election, there's a lot of interest around Polymarket, which is a place to bet not only on politics, but probably more popular, even sports and things like financial earnings reports and
weather.
all sorts of things. So for our listeners who are not familiar with Polymarket, could you explain what it is and what sets it apart from earlier forms of prediction markets?
Effectively, it's just a more or less a gambling website, right? But it's very crypto driven. So I think that's what has generated quite a lot of appeal for people. I do find that, maybe this is my own personal opinion, that crypto kind of provides like an extra layer of separation between you and the money that you're losing. You might be like buying cryptocurrency and then betting with that. It's a logic that video game companies use relentlessly, right?
It's like when you casino, you get chips. You don't
Exactly.
give away the cat.
You're not going up to the dealer and giving him a £10 note. You're placing chips, right? It's to kind of abstract you from the money a little bit. But yeah, I'd say the main thing that separates Polymarket from anything else is purely the scale. It's colossal. Something like the US presidential market for 2024 had close to $4 billion worth of bets placed on there, and close to it was about 1.5 to 2 billion was placed on Trump alone. I did have a look before this pod to see what the market was looking like for the 2028 one. Matt and I wrote a book chapter on forecasting a few months ago, and at the time it was only about $10 million had been placed. Now it's up to about 40 million. And hilariously, within that, Trump himself has a 3% chance, according to Polymarket, of winning the 2028 election, even though he is ineligible. So fundamentally, it's the scale that it operates at that really sets Polymarket apart.
One additional thing I'd say, so I agree, fundamentally, yeah, that's correct. The kind of volume of traffic is a distinguishing feature. But I think what made Polymarket sort of jump into the kind of politics, news, analysis sphere was the recent US presidential election campaign. I think at several points. So, for example, when Joe Biden withdrew his nomination due to the kind of living death that he was enduring across the campaign, Polymarket had like anticipated that very strongly about a week before the eventual resignation. So it started to kind of drive a bit of the news cycle. And then as the campaign reached its apogee, it was called the Polymarket divergence. So Polymarket was much more bullish on Trump than what the polls would have implied, right? So I was teaching a group at the time in the university, and I had one team doing betting markets and the other team doing polling. And they had so the betting markets, and especially Polymarket, were much more bullish on Trump, like much earlier. And what astonished me was on the night of the count, even when all of the reportage that I was about as across the count as I think I could humanly a bit. But nonetheless, Polymarket started shifting during the count fast.
Yeah.
Right. It took reality, it seemed to me, 2 hours to kind of catch up with that. So there was a sort of not just a scale of gambling, but a series of kind of superior predictive performances to some of the other methods that Louise listed. And that's not an exclusive feature of Polymarket. I mean, we've had political gambling. It's literally a phenomenon that goes back to the 19th century. But Polymarket's kind of granularity and speed relative to public understanding, I think, is what put it to the forefront of people's minds as a sort of superior way of understanding what's about to happen.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's also Polymarket specific. I'd have to spend some time looking at more competitors, but Polymarket updates very fast, which really helps push it, and markets get pushed ahead of the other forms, because with a poll, someone's got to front that, someone's got to pay for it, somebody has to commission it, somebody has to design the poll, somebody has to recruit people to conduct the poll, you have to get participants, you have to ask them, you have to synthesize and produce a report on the data. Polymarket, I could go onto a market right now and place a bet, and the odds might change just a teeny bit depending on how much money I place instantaneously. So it's as Matt is saying, on the night we were in a pub watching the results come in. Definitely weren't drinking any alcohol.
We had a lot of laptops and stuff.
We did. It was like a kind of Jack Bauer CTU. We had 50 screens up, and but you were just watching the odds go tick, 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 and eventually it just exponentially shot for Trump in the middle of the night.
Which kind of brings us to this idea of the wisdom of the crowd, right? And I think whether it's an opinion poll or a prediction market, you're kind of trying to glean the wisdom of the crowd, whether that's a representative sample or, Polymarket, which we have no idea what the sample actually is because the users are anonymous. So what are the kind of pros and cons of trusting this wisdom of the crowd? Because what I want to ask about later is the power of individual forecasters. But here we're looking at a kind of an anonymous mass of people who are betting on politics. But as you said, sometimes that can actually be more accurate and more updated than what the news is actually reporting.
Yeah, so I mean, the wisdom of the crowd has its origins in the story of Francis Galston, something like that, Galton. But the kind of general logic is that there was a stall affair where you had to guess the weight of an ox, and he, everyone's throwing in their guesses, and he thinks that what if it's better to just take the average of all of these predictions or all of these guesses, because they're not really predictions, but all of these guesses, and submit that, and their actual wisdom of the crowd was a pound off the actual weight. The fundamental kind of premise of that is that everybody who's contributing, everyone who's predicting, is informing their predictions with their own lived experiences, with their own lives and stuff. So a good example for that is people who were predicting that there might have been farmers in that crowd, people who work with ox, or like maybe bakers who are very good at measuring things by eye, right? Like everyone has their own individual backgrounds that help provide an extra, it's like a piece in a jigsaw, right? And that can be fundamentally powerful when you operate at a big scale. The issue might then become what happens when somebody comes in and is just an idiot and predicts 3 times the weight of the ox because they think that that's true. When you start to operate at a big enough scale, people like that get cancelled out by people in the other direction, right? Somebody who comes in and suggests the ox is actually 3 times heavier than it is cancelled out by somebody who thinks it's 3 times.
By like the 10,000 people who can see what the size of the ox is.
Exactly. So these people are introducing what you'd call noise, whereas the people who are really clustering around the actual truth are the signal that we have to try and listen to. So when you operate at a big enough scale, which is why Polymarket, we have concerns about who is doing this prediction and how might that have an effect.
It's very opaque.
Exactly. But then when you get enough people in there, chances are it kind of starts to maybe crowd out that risk for manipulation. It doesn't eliminate it, but it's definitely possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same logic on which capitalism basically rests, if you think about it that way. I think the underlying metaphysical logic is statistical, where that can be quite helpful in seeing the potential downsides as well. So, like, the center point of any distribution is a good summary, but not so much if you have a biased kind of data generating process, that will be biased. So, like, I think of, for example, the sort of failures of prediction that we've experienced communally, right? So a major one being the Brexit referendum. And I think that fundamentally there was a failure of polling there, right? And I think polling is often the kind of underlying data that these markets are sort of processing. Now, the issue with polling is there are public polls and there are private polls, and there are public-facing data analyses and private-facing ones. And so there's a sort of an idea, a little bit like Louis said, of sort of hidden knowledge can kind of make its way into the market. But it's also kind of, to me, as someone who tries to make a living analyzing elections, it's kind of scary that there's stuff out there that's driving these types of divergences. And I've no idea, like we discussed, carefully by election, there's been quite a big betting market divergence into like reform as favorites. I'm like, is that the wisdom of the crowd, or is that just because city boys like to bet on Welsh politics?
Yeah, and that's what I'd like to ask about, because like if we take the ox example, I mean, that's kind of assuming that everyone has one equal vote. And there's some outliers and they get canceled out by scale. But I think some of the concerns around Polymarket was that you'd have some kind of, whales or some big pocketed fish that would, flood the market with a certain prediction. And then it's not one person, one vote. It's based on how much money is put into the betting market. And so I think some of the public concerns around that have been that if people see the market moving in one direction, that might actually influence people's opinions. And there's some research on that in terms of the bandwagon effect. So could you explain what that type of concern about seeing how an election might go could influence voter behavior?
Yeah, I mean, like fundamentally, and this is not meaning to sound like the academic in the ivory tower talking down on people don't really know what's going on. I don't think people pay anywhere near as much attention to elections as we do. I think obviously people do. But from our perspective, it's all about this kind of objective examination from the outside. Why is this candidate winning? Why isn't this candidate winning? But fundamentally, what that misses is the kind of social dynamics that come from you following an election, right? And the shortcuts that people take when it comes to the information that they consume. So principally, when it comes to like how can a forecast influence voter behavior, we usually think about it in like one of two ways. There are many other ways, but you have the bandwagon and the underdog effect, right? So the bandwagon is, I don't know who I'm going to vote for. Turn on the news. Oh, I see Hillary Clinton has a 90% chance of winning in 2016. I'll vote for her. Why not?
Sort of social proof.
Yeah. There can be we often hear the term gets thrown around a lot, especially with Trump, of the silent majority, just as a way of referring to this idea of there being a shame around who you vote for, there being some kind of guilt, right? That is kind of in this general ballpark of, conceptually, that maybe you don't know who to vote for, but you're going to vote a certain way because you feel like you should. And if you think that a candidate's winning, maybe you want to be on the winning side. But if you're looking at a toss-up between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and you're voting on the basis of I just want to be on the winning side, then you're not really attached to either's politics. The underdog is the other way around, where it's, oh, I see Hillary Clinton has a 90% chance of winning according to this prediction. I want to vote for Trump. I want to keep him in the race. I want to see how far he can go. I want to own the libs would be like the main expression from 2016, that like the underdog effect is manifested in that. There's one of the best examples of the underdog effect taking place is wanting to own the libs. You just want to keep Trump in the race because people are getting mad that he's there. But there is a defensive side to that too, right? It's the whole in-group, out-group thing that we see in psychology all the time of, I want to protect my boy. I want to stand up for my candidate, and he's losing. The liberal media don't want him to win. I'm going to double down in my support. The average citizen is bombarded by information about poll this, poll that. This YouGov, MRP model, whatever, says that your constituency is going to vote 63%, whatever. And you're just constantly being hit by that relentlessly. So, people respond to that, whether they think they do or not, right? So it's just something. The final thing I'd say is, to the listeners, if you realize that maybe you're reacting to a poll, maybe you're doing one of those two things, right? Really, a poll is not there to tell you how to vote. It's there telling you how everybody else is going to vote, and you should make your decision independent of that.
I'd say just a couple of things. So in human history and a lot of folklore, like prophecy always sort of comes at a cost. So think about, I don't know, Macbeth or something, right? Like, so knowing your fate is generally not something that people really want in any event. But the existence of like predictions of political outcomes shaping political behavior is as old as political behavior or as old as time, right? So when you choose at the most granular level of politics, you're on a school governance board, like you choose who to kind of get behind with a view to like having the kind of outcome that you want, right? Oftentimes. And in politics, there's a whole area of like candidate selection, and that's where bandwagon can take place, not at the level of a voter, but party donors, party kind of bigwigs, like deciding who to kind of get behind. All of which is to say, like, people are good at politics or people are good at picking winners. So I think that it's not so new in that sense. But I think, Michael, what you put your finger on is true. There is a potential to kind of change a narrative somewhat in a campaign. And what's kind of remarkable is not only did that happen in 2024, but they were correct. I don't think that they changed the outcome, but they cashed in on it rather than it being an expensive way of campaigning, which does diminish the kind of manipulative type argument. But I would say that finally, as well, that Polymarket is, I think, valued now at $8 billion. So the scale of its activities beyond what we just see on the website must be incredible. And again, it's a very opaque system.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, as you're saying, like, people are bombarded with polling information, and this has been going on for years, right? But I think there's kind of this element, especially with Polymarket, pertaining to the news amplification of it. Like, I would have never heard of Polymarket without the 2024 election. And I think that, when you have a lot of news reporting that says, oh my God, there's this like, blockchain driven betting market that's predicting reform to win or Trump to win, then I do think that news amplification of the odds diverging from the polling would probably be the most likely scenario that it could have an effect on voter behavior. So it's also not just that this thing exists, but that it is making its way into the public and media discourse that draws attention to, hey, there's this opaque thing that is predicting something that the polls aren't. I think that can have a mobilizing effect.
And just to say, the point of view of sort of statistical, it violates the assumption of independence that actually lies below the wisdom of the crowd type argument. Does that make sense? So the wisdom of the crowd, like, you don't have a running commentary on how the bull weighing is going.
Yeah.
Everyone makes an independent evaluation. So that in statistics allows for aggregation, where there's a loop back into the data generating process. Exactly what you said, but I'm just saying it from a more like statsy perspective.
Yeah,
it introduces like a bias element.
Yeah, if you were going to go and submit your prediction for the weight of the ox or whatever, and they had a big screen up top that said this is the current average, like that will absolutely affect what you're going to say.
Or certainly you could manipulate a process like that very easily by having someone just guess 3 times as much. Whereas to do that where they're all just counted independently, you'd need to manipulate more people, basically.
Yeah,
It's an interesting way of thinking about it.
You'd see what the average is, and then you would just get like 10 of your mates to all say, I reckon it weighs 200 million pounds. And then you get your friend to go in and predict right next to what the average was beforehand. Watch the wisdom of the crowd get skewed, and then you come in with the win.
It's one of these classic social research. When you manipulate people through sort of social proof, it is a really pernicious way to get at someone.
Yeah, especially with like coverage of, to use like polls as the example, it's this very like top down, like elite driven kind of thing. Like if you talk about the opacity of prediction markets, polls to the average Joe are also extremely opaque, right? And prediction models, right? I mean, Lichtman is a counterexample of that. It's a very simple, transparent model, but it's still very much like if you're learning about polls, chances are you're watching the news. This is a big news organization. It might have political bias. It's being presented by elite newscasters or whatever who are presenting just some poll result that you know nothing about until they mentioned it. It's the same kind of thing, right? It's just the threats to the integrity or the origins of that information is slightly different when it comes to Polymarket. But Polymarket, to be devil's advocate, can also work in the opposite direction because the chances of you ever being polled are quite low. But the chance that you can go on Polymarket and place a bet, like I could do that right now, right? And I'm contributing to that crowd information. So there's a kind of an empowering element to it as well, where you're directly feeding into public opinion.
Yeah. And I mean, we've been talking about this in terms of how it might affect voters, but I'd like to turn over to some of your research and starting with you, Professor Wall. When I was on your podcast, we were talking about a study you've done on the 2007 Irish elections, looking at websites. And I was curious. I went back and looked at that study, and I was surprised to find that you had used bookmakers' odds in research to basically create a categorical variable whether these Irish candidates were frontrunners or challengers. So there is some research applications for using the odds that these betting markets can generate. So could you tell us a little bit about that study and why you chose to use bookmakers' odds in a statistical analysis?
Yeah, sure thing. So
you've like activated a neuron at the back of his brain. Oh my God, it's like cobwebs back there now.
Some very pleasant memories of mid 2000s Dublin, where I was doing that work. So I had essentially like a lot of projects. It started off with a colleague who had an idea. So this colleague was a PhD student. I was a PhD student at the time. She was working on digital campaigning, and she was focusing a lot on the activities of parties. But the literature was starting to show the kind of boost in votes that you got from having a digital presence relative to not having it. An election was called, and she and I said, well, let's just do essentially a web scrape, basically use Google to see if we can find a website for the candidates that were running. I think, you're testing my memory, I think it was only something like a third of candidates even had a website. And then we obviously wanted to see, well, does having a website make you perform better in the election? For that kind of research question, like controlling for everything else is such an important part of things. Because if I show you, well, people websites tended to perform better, you could very well say to me, well, they just had more money. That's a kind of spurious correlation. So we put in a lot of control variables, but a colleague in the department just kind of casually told us that he was involved in setting these individual level candidate odds for a bookmaker. Political gambling does have quite a long history in Ireland, but this was the start of more like online gambling, and they thought having constituency level, like individual candidate odds, would be profitable for them. So we kind of knew about this database, and we kind of thought, well, what better assessment could we really have of someone's likelihood of winning at the start of the campaign, which is the control we're looking for, than something that where money could be exchanged if you were wrong in that assessment. Do you know what I mean? So betting market in that sense was great because it gave us a candidate level granularity. And I think we found in the end something like 500 extra votes accrued to candidates with the website, controlling for their likelihood at the start of the campaign by the betting markets, among like literally 30 other control variables. So I started to see the use of it as a control, but the use I've made of it later on, and where I continue to see a lot of value, is in its like temporal granularity, which is to say that if you want to make sense of the dynamics of a campaign, who's like what are the moments that shift things, polling is very lumpy because a poll might be in the field 2, 3, 4 days. You get a sort of a single snapshot, as Louis said, but what that snapshot represents temporally is a little bit vague.
Yeah.
Especially if there's a big moment in the campaign that you're trying to analyze. So that's what I've kind of picked up on them later on, is that they enable quite a scientific evaluation of the campaign dynamics of a particular campaign and allow you to kind of isolate, okay, did the market start to move before and after, let's say, COVID?
Yeah.
Like, did that shift things? That's where that, like Louis said, moment by moment by moment price probability is, I think, very valuable for scholars.
Definitely. And I think kind of one of the key differences is that there's money on the line, right? So when you ask someone about, how likely are you to vote or who are you going to vote for? I mean, self-reports are free. There's no cost to the polling participant, whether they say, they're likely or very likely to vote for this candidate. But bookmakers, there's money exchanged at the end based on the odds. And so I think that involves a little bit more seriousness. And as you said, can be a good way to pick up what are the events that are actually moving a campaign.
And that's why I think on election night, for example, why the movements happen so fast is because probably right up until election night, a lot of people would have had a lot of money on certain outcomes. And it was definitely in that toss-up territory on election night. If there's a very real possibility that if you don't change your prediction, you're about to lose a lot of money, people act,
like
right?
$100 million. Yeah.
Like you can see the amount of money that people are placing on Polymarket. And yeah, if I was going into election night and I'm sat in the pub with Matt and I've got $3,000 placed on Harris to win, and then I see like slight movement in the market, like, yeah, hell yeah, I'm going to move that money like ASAP.
But you're not going to call YouGov and say, hey, please change my very likely response to moderately likely.
Do you want to know what my bet, which I don't know, will it ever be resolved? Like, what was that sort of source of extra information? So I think like algorithmic trading based on artificial intelligence, Polymarket is like the perfect place for that to happen. It's so liquid, and so there's so much trading going on. I do wonder, was that the kind of source? Were there enough sort of essentially like artificial intelligence based trading happening that it kind of created a momentum? I mean, you do see that in the stock markets now increasingly as well. You get these random escalations where some algorithmic threshold has been triggered, but nobody knew it was going to happen until it does. And just to say, finally, when we had our forecasting tournament for the 2024 election, Louis very cleverly created like ChatGPT as a player, and we just asked it, and it won the tournament.
It did. I mean, we can get into that in a little bit, but it basically offered like a lot of 60-40s, and it won.
But like we were just literally typing it into ChatGPT, but like you can imagine the kind of models people are building in this space.
Yeah, and obviously like on election night as well, there are, to go back to the point about investing a lot of money, you probably have extraordinarily hyper-informed individuals who aren't sitting there watching it unfold casually with their mates. They're sitting there with, again, 20 screens with all of their different accounts, and eventually like there do start to become telltale signs on election night, right? Like if you see that their votes are going up in a swing state, Harris is expected to win, but she's currently only at like 52-48, like that starts to paint a different picture.
Florida district by district often seems to me, in thinking back, to be a tipping point. Basically, I tend to watch election results nights with a decent sized bet on the result, and therefore watch the market fluctuations. And Florida and US presidential campaigns, those kind of district by district, like Miami-Dade was famously in 2016. But like it does seem to be a point where a lot of betting money seems to move. But obviously the political commentary can't be too definitive.
No, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, definitely. There's kind of bellwether districts and areas. But I want to get into the work you've been doing with forecasting and your thesis work, Dr. Bromfield. But first, I think we should pivot and set the stage a bit from moving from these kind of aggregate markets to individual forecasters. And through reading your work, I was really surprised, I didn't know this before, that there's been a lot of governmental interest in forecasting to see whether you can sort of have forecasters and super forecasters that can predict situations and outcomes better than intelligence experts, which I think is kind of super interesting. So there's kind of this public-private partnership that's been going on in the forecasting space for some time. So could you set the stage here for the listeners about the kind of development of this forecasting research? Kind of what was it about, and kind of what have we found about what makes a good forecaster?
Yeah, so Matt mentioned him right at the start, but like when I started working with Matt back in 2019, there's too many years of my life have gone to Matt Wall. But when we started working together, the first kind of scholar that he introduced me to was Phil Tatlock, who is, I don't know, he's kind of like the Elvis Presley of of forecasting. He's like our North Star that we all follow. He basically put out two books. One of them is called Expert Political Judgment, and the second one's called Super Forecasting. And Expert Political Judgment is, the premise of that was him distributing a survey to a bunch of experts, bunch of academics, getting them to predict a bunch of outcomes. And it turns out they're all terrible at it. Like they're all really, really bad. And these are people who are meant to be like the most informed members of society, right? It's your job to actually pay attention. And obviously, Matt and I are kind of manifestations of that because we've gotten many predictions wrong, even though it's our job. But that whole book was like a reflection on like, okay, wow, we need to actually do some reflection here because this is terrible. Like I think he said that the quote that he used was, they were no more accurate than a dart throwing chimpanzee, right? You're no better at like the random guessing, basically. So then super forecasting was like the follow on to that, which was, there's got to be a way that we can be better at making predictions. So there's this whole like body of work. But I should say, as a second bit of context, is this is kind of all emerging in like a post 9/11 world, which is 9/11 was such a colossally big thing. How did we not see it coming? Right. And obviously, if you want to get into the American politics of it all, kind of 9/11 and subsequent terror attacks have been used to justify a mass increase in surveillance and military industrial complex and all this. But it's fundamentally changed our relationship with information. But Tetlock's work was emerging out of that and saying that the intelligence community, you think about the weapons of mass destruction, when they're not being weapons of mass destruction, like all of these are intelligence failures. These are all prediction failures.
Well, he'd even go further. He said that the over bullishness on like invading Iraq was actually a consequence of the lessons of 9/11. So he called it ping pong governance.
Yeah.
So you move from being like too risk allowing to being too risk averse. You don't have a kind of a setting that's logical. You just have a setting that's essentially political and ass covering in nature.
It was, we got that way too wrong with 9/11. So now let's go in the exact opposite direction and go way too aggressive in the other way. So that's kind of like the context, right? And then super forecasting is Tetlock saying, okay, I'm going to try and see if we can make regular people better forecasters, because these people, I mean, they might have a lower baseline, but obviously from a research point of view, the average person signing up for an experiment is a bit more accessible than somebody who works for like the FBI. But he devised forecasting tournaments. Okay, so it's a competitive context for predicting where you are scored on your predictions, right? So there's a formula, which I won't get into, but it's called the Brier score, which is kind of typically, he used that quite a lot, where you basically say, okay, if I think that there's an 80% chance that Trump wins this election, I am also saying there's a 20% chance that he doesn't. And a big part of this whole research in this space is making people aware of both sides of that. You aren't just saying one thing's going to happen, you're also saying this other thing isn't going to happen. And that kind of forces you to, it's one thing to be comfortable giving Trump an 80% chance. Am I comfortable with giving Kamala Harris a 20% chance, for example, right? So that kind of changes your relationship with what you're predicting. Effectively, all of this culminates, to oversimplify all of his research in his entire career, into a bifurcation of forecasters. Cool. I mean, it's more of a spectrum, but for all intents and purposes, we'll say it's two categories of hedgehogs and foxes. So this is Isaiah Berlin, right? The hedgehog is somebody who is kind of sees everything through like a particular worldview. Religion is probably the quintessential example of this, where you have kind of objective reality at the top, and you've got you at the bottom, and then there's like this like threshold that everything needs to, all the information needs to pass through. For many people, that could be something like religion. So I think the best example of this is when Trump was shot in Pennsylvania, when he was shot in the ear. A large amount of the discussion around that was the reason why he didn't die was because God protected him. God turned his head at the last minute, right? And I say this all the time, but if God protected Trump by turning his head, what happened to Charlie Kirk? That's always just something that I throw out because it's a bit of a flaw in that logic. But that's how that perception operates. The reason why this happened is because of this worldview that I have, and everything filters through that.
Or just, another example is like a political pundit who's aligned very much with the political party, which is, obviously a big feature of American media. So, somebody who can take any news event and sort of spin it into, I don't know, a narrative about a great replacement theory, or a Marxist-Leninist would be a hedgehog as well.
Yeah.
Someone who's kind of ideologically coherent to the point that they see everything through one interpretive lens.
Yeah. And that's a very important thing, is like both of these forecasting styles, I'll get into Fox's in a second, they are bipartisan. Anyone can be either of them, right? And what you'll probably typically find is that the people who are further to the political extremes become more hedgehog-like, right? Because they're kind of much more tied to a more radical view of the world. But Foxes are kind of, on the other hand, are what you would expect to be a good forecaster, right? So they take information from a bunch of different sources. They're not afraid to update their predictions. They see failure as a chance to learn. They're not stubborn at all. And fundamentally, one of the best things that they're good at is separating out what you think is going to happen from what you want to happen, right? So the hedgehogs are in the other camp, where they kind of predict what they want to happen rather than what they think will happen. And to cut a long story short, Tetlock would do these kind of iterative tournaments and slowly but surely find out who's the best, because obviously you can't just get them to predict one thing. You have to kind of iterate and keep getting them to predict things. And like the top 2%, I think, was his threshold of these people that he called super forecasters. And these people would be predicting things 300 days out when a regular person was predicting something 100, 150 days out. And like, that's a massive difference.
And just to say, I think two other things. One of the layers that they put in was like the training and teaming.
Yes.
So like when you give people training in probabilistic statistics, that helps them. When you team people who are good together, the team performance has a sort of synergistic boost.
Teams would outperform the individual super forecasters because they're benefiting from each other. Wisdom of the crowd, if you will.
But and the type of improvement in predictive accuracy is actually quite difficult to explain, because it's to do with the change in the Breyer score of which is itself something that doesn't sort of scale very logically. They're more likely to be accurate and more likely to be early, like Louis said.
Yeah.
So the issue is, like, we have this concept, or Tetlock introduced it, of the God profile. Right? So the God profile instantly knows exactly what's going to happen perfectly. So any improvement is really just approaching the God profile. And whether there is or isn't a God is beyond my scholarly expertise. But he doesn't tend to play forecasting tournaments.
No, exactly.
So it's just to say the type of shift, like Tetlock had a New York Times bestseller explaining it, to be fair, but it is difficult to conceptualize because it's on a gradient between the God profile and then the kind of reverse God profile, who is completely wrong perfectly about everything. So we all exist in between those things.
Yeah. And one of the other things that they did was they started tweaking people's predictions after they'd made them. They called it extremization.
Yeah.
So what that is effectively doing is, like, if the best forecasters are saying that there's like an 85% chance that something happens, they might up it to like 88, 89, 90, because the general logic is that that's already an extremely bullish prediction of something that's going to happen. But the extremization is predicated on this idea that you're making that prediction with an incomplete set of knowledge. That there's something that you don't know everything. So extremization is meant to kind of simulate, okay, if you're saying 85% chance that this happens with what you know, maybe if you knew a little bit more, it might go a bit further. And usually it was like you have the regular forecasters who are outperformed by super forecasters, and then the super forecasters are outperformed by teams of super forecasters, and then they're outperformed by extremization.
Team extreme.
So yeah, radicalization is the way to go, according to
But I think what this kind of points to, and you hinted on it with this kind of team element, is that, to arrive at these research findings, you have to have these kind of tournaments where you can kind of follow people over time. And that leads us to your doctoral work, Dr. Bromfield, where you developed a website called Fantasy Forecast to host your own forecasting tournaments. And in particular, you were interested in whether you could introduce these gamification elements into the forecasting tournament and how that would affect political engagement. So could you set the stage here for why focus on gamification and its relationship to political engagement in the context of forecasting?
Yeah, absolutely. It came to gamification because Matt told me to do it back in 2020. Matt said, do gamification. No, like there is an actual reason. One of the things that we kind of talked about right at the start is the fact that forecasting can just be a chat with your mates. It can also be an extremely formal process. And when we formalize it, we start to introduce elements like accountability, right? And scoring. So you can we can get an understanding of who is a good forecaster, who is a bad forecaster. However, as we kind of alluded to with the mentions of like things like a Breyer score, it's boring as hell, right? Like I can't go to people and say, here's a Briar score. Give me a probabilistic forecast between 0 and 100%, and I will calculate your score using the squared deviation of probabilistic outcomes, whatever. No one cares. Gamification is like the bridge. Gamification is the way that we translate these formal academic processes into something that's more enjoyable, that's more palatable. Gamification, for people who are unaware, is simply just making something more game-like. It happens everywhere. I'm wearing an Apple Watch. There is gamification built into this. So, for example, if I move a certain amount during the day, I'll get a little badge that comes up saying, like, well done, you move a certain amount of minutes or you burned a certain amount of calories. People who use like Strava, for example, that's gamification, right? You get personal best, you get little medals, and you get to flex it to other people. Gamification's function is to say, okay, how can we translate like boring things or niche things into something that's more palatable for the general public? And gamification makes sense because it is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Think about rewards that you get from a coffee shop, for example. That's gamification, right? Whether it's a very small, low fidelity version or whether it's some high-tech platform, it's everywhere.
And obviously games,
games,
sport. I mean, so Fantasy Forecast, the title kind of was an adaptation of fantasy football. So I think the gap we saw in terms of gamification was twofold. In the first place, Tetlock had focused very much on making people better forecasters, whereas we wanted to flip it and say, well, what's forecasting doing to people? So that's always a good trick as an academic, is just like for the independent.
It's an original idea. It's original.
But also we just saw like that millions of people are spending billions of hours in forecasting tournaments, but that they are gamified fairly heavily. So again, if you're playing fantasy soccer, you get to mess around with like, who's my captain this week? Do I do a transfer? Can I start a league with my friends? So we were like, people are doing forecasting tournaments at a massive scale. And where that happens, where people are opting in, it was always a game.
Yeah. So we kind of like, we couldn't directly steal the idea of fantasy football because MTV had already beaten us to it with Fantasy Election years ago, which was very much the same thing, was pick politicians for your team. And it's not quite as entertaining as sports. Like, oh, Barack Obama has signed an executive order. I get 20 points. Like it's
the did cut constituency. Yeah.
And MTV reported that to be a really successful endeavor. But for me, in retrospect, it just seemed boring, right? Like, who cares if a bill gets passed, right? Where forecasting works really well in terms of marrying it with gamification is that you are doing it. You are making predictions regularly. So Fantasy Forecast was the culmination of all of this. It was, as Matt said, let's see what this does to people when they use it, because that's just something that isn't really explored at all. So Fantasy Forecast was created over a couple of iterations. It's meant to be like a social media site. You have a homepage with a feed. You can interact with other users. You have
league tables.
You have a profile page. There were quizzes, all of this stuff. And yeah, we focused, because we only had like a kind of a short period of time for our data collection. We focused on psychological attributes to measure. Not only did we focus on these things because of that, but we focused on them because there's a great overlap between this kind of psychological engagement that we're talking about and political forecasting research, right? All of those attributes of a good forecaster, a lot of it is psychological. A lot of it is open-mindedness. It is, not being stubborn. So there are these kind of ideal traits of a good forecaster that there are also really ideal traits of a good citizen, right? Somebody who knows what they're talking about, somebody who's interested in politics, somebody who thinks that they can make a difference. So that kind of married itself in terms of explaining why gamification, why forecasting. They kind of mesh together quite nicely.
Right. Like you were talking about before, these hedgehogs and these foxes. I mean, these are like cool names, but they kind of map on to psychological traits of, as you said, openness to new information and things like that. But what's really cool about this project is you actually coded and designed your own forecasting platform, building in these gamification elements that mapped on to operationalize particular psychological traits. So could you tell us a little bit about the design of that site and kind of what gamification elements you programmed in and what you were trying to measure?
Yeah, so I think it's important to mention that underlying gamification is like a massive body of research into, again, human psychology, right? You have to try and understand what is motivating people to use an app or use a platform or do whatever. Gamification in principle can be a vehicle for just getting people to do something they don't want to do, right? So motivation is underlying all of this. One of the like main psychological theories in this space is called self-determination theory, which is basically saying in a gamification context, you need to make people feel like they know what they're talking about, that they're competent. You need to make them feel that they're in control, and you need to make them feel socialized. And if you can kind of tick all of these boxes, people are more likely to enjoy the experience. So using that, as well as using the focus on political engagement, which we defined as knowledge, interest, and efficacy, internal efficacy, meaning I feel like I can make a difference. We kind of used all of those to guide the decisions that we were making on a design basis. So, for example, if we want people to feel socialized, profile pages, a home feed, comment sections, badges that you can maybe show off to other users, all of this.
Being able to like things. Yeah,
Comment on posts, all of this is socialization. From a knowledge perspective, we had quizzes, we had the actual forecasting process itself. We also introduced something which I think is quite an original contribution to the space, which we're doubling down on at the moment, is a breakdown of forecasting attributes, which are specific and informed by both your behavior and your performance. For example, a trait might be confidence. How close are you to saying like 100% chance something happens or 0% chance something happens? We can give feedback that is specific to your forecasting that you submit, but then we also compare that to your performance and say, okay, you were really confident with your predictions, but you performed terribly. So here's some kind of like nuanced feedback that says, maybe you're a bit bullish. Maybe you need to, think about other possible outcomes a little bit more, for example. So that's kind of a nice original contribution in this space. And if anybody steals that idea, I will be very upset. We can't patent that.
We also put money on the line. That's a gamification element, right? So ultimately there was a scoring metric that drove the whole game, as it were. But the top scorers got a financial prize.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a kind of a way of building some stakes into the game.
Yeah. And then autonomy. So a big part of this kind of feeling in control aspect was that we made it so that once you submit a prediction, you can update it as many times as you like, because obviously there are some ideal forecasting traits that we're trying to inculcate here, right? That you should be able to change your mind. You should be able to respond to new information. But the way that we adapted the Brier score was that like the earlier you did these things, the more points you stand to gain. So that was, again, another modification that we built into the design. Was a Brier score is really good for assessing how good a single prediction is. So I could say, I think Trump has an 83% chance of winning. And if I say that and Matt says a 60% chance of winning and Trump wins, I'm going to get more points. I'm going to get a better score. But fundamentally, the Brier score is super unintuitive. It's like golf. You can only get a score from 0 to 2, but smaller is better. That's how it's like golf. You want to try and get the smallest score possible. But from 0 to 2, it's like actually making meaningful distinctions between people on a 0 to 2 scale is really, really hard. So we then just flipped it and put it onto a scale of 0 to 100, which is more intuitive. But then that doesn't take into consideration like when you made that prediction. How early did you make that prediction? So we then added like a time dimension to that score, which says, okay, how early did you predict this in this whole kind of forecast timeline? And the earlier you do it and the longer it's kind of left as is before it's updated again, the bigger the score is going to be. So these are kind of the design decisions that we're making that are trying to either hit these like psychological needs that people have, or they're trying to increase people's levels of engagement through becoming more knowledgeable or feeling more in charge of what's going on.
But I think a really important feature was you had a training page that you built as well. So like Louis made videos and slide decks and quizzes that were, like in some of these more advanced games, you get like a training exercise as well. So that was a sort of knowledge boost feature.
Yeah. And I mean, it's almost impossible to sort of boil down all of this research into the next question I will ask, because I remember you had over something like 20 hypotheses in this study. But can you, I remember you ran this tournament, I think over 6 elections in the UK, sort of local, but please correct me if I'm wrong there. So Can you describe a bit how the process went and ultimately what were some of the key findings that came out of having people actually run through this fantasy forecast training and process?
Yeah, so we ran this over the 2023 UK local elections, which for people who don't really know UK politics, maybe a good comparison with a few caveats I'll explain is that they're kind of like our midterms for the US. The main difference is that we're not electing the same people that you'd be electing in a general election or a presidential election, for example. Local elections are like your councillors. So it's one of the lowest forms of governance that you can be elected to.
Those tiers, rather.
Yeah, tiers. No, I will say forms. These are no tiers, lowest tiers. It's like people who are in charge of when the bins get collected, right? But the main function that they serve is, again, this point that we made about polls is that it's like a temperature check on the national mood. It's a free hit for people to just give a middle finger to the government and say, I don't like what you're doing.
People familiar with election study literature would call it a second order election.
Second order election, yeah. So they're still important and the news will still make a big deal out of them. But we're expecting, for example, Labour to get absolutely hammered in the next local elections, right? Because people are not happy with the Labour government. So it still worked really nicely in our favor because it was an election and it was UK where we are. And there are still national implications of this. Additionally, they're not just councillors. In 2023, there are a few mayoral races, and mayors are quite important. If anyone's aware of British politics at the moment, you'll realize the kind of outsized role that Andy Burnham is playing in British politics right now, where people are contemplating him being the new prime minister. He's currently the mayor of Manchester. So there's a nice spread. So we had some money, a little bit of cash, a little bit of dough, to pay for 500 people to participate in this experiment. We got 400 to use the site, and we put 100 in a control group where they don't use the site. We give them both a survey before the election, and we give them both a survey after the election, and then we compare the differences. Probably one of the main things that we found was that people in the treatment group who used the website actually did become more knowledgeable, but they just didn't perceive it happening. We measured their objective knowledge with a quiz and their self-perceived knowledge. Fundamentally, one thing that worked against us is that this whole thing happened over 2 weeks, which is, it does make it a longitudinal study, but a very small longitudinal study. But the longer the lag between surveys, the greater the risk of people dropping out. And given that I was 5 months away from submitting my PhD, I didn't really want to roll that dice because that could have been very, very bad for me. So we found that. We also found that there was a great deal of interplay between all of these various psychological dimensions. So, for example, people who completed the survey first, in that survey, if they said that they had higher levels of efficacy and knowledge, so they kind of had this elevated perception of themselves, they then actually submitted much more confident predictions. So there was a manifestation of those psychological attributes in their behavior on the site. People who used the site more were much more psychologically fulfilled by using the site across a bunch of different measures that we had. Same thing happened with performance. People who performed better generally had better perceptions of the site at the end. Obviously, we have it's a bit blurry in terms of the directions of these things, but there is still an interplay between how well you did and how much you enjoyed the process.
Which, just to say, I think more for future research and the kind of project going forward, it's something we're still not sure how to do. How do you motivate someone to continue to engage by telling them that they're a moron? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So some people are going to get kind of straight away quite a run of good scores, and for whatever reason, they're foxes, they're informed. Some people are going to realize that they're wrong all the time.
Yeah.
And Louis, the first person to do this kind of work at all, but it sort of does signal that those people who are just at the bottom of the leaderboard, there's a risk of disengagement actually.
Yeah.
And that we have to think about.
Yeah, so this was one of the other really cool findings that I found. And to be honest, the visualization might not seem super compelling because it's just 10 box plots that all look exactly the same. But that was a lot of my thesis was null results. But setting that to one side and looking into the granularity of one of the findings was I put along an x-axis how knowledgeable people felt they were before they started using the site. And then on the y-axis, it was how much did their self-perceived knowledge change having used the website. And effectively, if you were drawing a line of best fit, it was a downward sloping line. If you were thinking in terms of correlation, a negative correlation, right? That the more knowledgeable you felt you were before you started using the site, the more likely your self-perceived knowledge was to have gone down by using the site. And I talked about this, I spent a couple of pages in my thesis talking about this, like a realization effect. And so this kind of comes back to what we were talking about right at the start about formalizing all of the processes, because people don't have this accountability to forecasting. People might have come onto this site thinking they know a great deal about British politics. And then I'm like, hey, who's going to win the mayoral race in Bedfordshire? And they're like, I didn't even know Bedfordshire had a mayor. I didn't even know that this was happening.
And then it turns out I was wrong about it.
And then I got it wrong. Yeah. Like the people who had the lower levels of political knowledge before the start, their distributions of how their knowledge changed was more likely to be in the positive side, right? Obviously, everything's kind of within the margin of error, and I'd love to repeat this on a much bigger scale over a longer period of time. But when you're really trying to pick apart what's happening to people, especially as Matt said, that this really hasn't been done before, this idea that you could come to a platform like this and just realize and kind of, to quote Erling Haaland, the Man City football player, stay humble, eh? This was a realization for many people that maybe they don't know as much as they do.
Yeah, kind of a revert to the mean.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. What I'd like to ask you about, kind of wrapping up here, is where this is going, because I know that you've partnered with a game design company to continue this project going forward. And I'm just curious if you could explain a little bit the motivations there, and what are you hoping to achieve with this sort of updated version of a forecasting platform?
Well, we're taking it into the crypto space. So we're launching the Swansea coin.
It's got an image of an immigrant eating a swan, because apparently that's what's happening in the UK now. Our populist right-wing leaders have started to say that all of our swans are being eaten.
Just if we made it a more like manipulative right-wing account, I'm sure Peter Thiel would.
Yeah. There's some money to be made. We have kept open the grift as a potential option in case things don't happen.
Yeah, well, with the state of UK higher education, you have to have some options.
Yeah.
The exciting news, I suppose, we've had is we've integrated this into the Welsh election study project, which we won here at Swansea.
You won. Take the credit.
It's the royal we. And we also had an impact acceleration account funding to kind of refresh the design. So the initial phase of our collaboration with this gaming company, Focus Games, that was initially funded by Wizard, which is a kind of a research institute here in Wales across the universities. And then we had the Economic and Social Research Council gives these impact acceleration awards. And so that's kind of kept us developing the site in terms of just the human labor that goes into that. And then we had it included in the Welsh election study as a kind of public engagement element. So that's been the kind of funding story of the project. But Louis can tell you a bit more about the actual substance.
Yeah, so our entire roadmap when working on Fantasy Forecast, which is now rebranded to Horse Race Politics, which is an infinitely cooler name, if I do say so myself.
We've had some disappointing guests on the podcast, though, Michael.
Yes, we now have an accompanying podcast with that, the Horse Race Politics podcast, available on YouTube and Spotify. But whenever we've operated through the previous iterations of Fantasy Forecast and now with horse races, we've tried to basically pick one election at a time to focus on and really gear all our efforts around. Design of the site as well gets kind of related to the election that we're focusing on. So the roadmap for now is that we're gearing up for the Senedd elections here in Wales, which are next May.
And the Senedd is just the Welsh Parliament, just for non-Welsh speakers.
So, and like, it's really exciting, and I'd love to get into it, but I'll try and keep it succinct. But for people who are kind of outside of Wales, I can't tell you enough how big a deal this election could be. Fundamentally, Welsh Labour has never not been the biggest party following a Senedd election. It's always been either the outright largest, or it's been in like an agreement with a smaller party like Plaid Cymru, which is
it's always been the largest. It's been on the edge of a majority.
Yeah, basically. That's a better way of saying it. Yeah. But now, because Labour have just been catastrophically bad since they came into power, and Welsh Labour haven't really done anything to separate themselves from that.
They've arguably been outstanding in terms of how bad they've been.
Yeah.
We've had a First Minister resign. The transition in Labour governance has been about as bad as it could have been.
Yeah. And so now they're polling around kind of like the low teens. And right now we have Plaid Cymru, which is like the pro-independence progressive left party, and Reform UK, which is Nigel Farage's newest right-wing endeavour, neck and neck in the lead. So we also have a great deal of electoral reform. The Senedd is growing in size. The way that people are elected is changing this election. The constituency sizes are changing. It's colossally different. So that gives us an amazing opportunity to jump into something where like nobody has any clue what's going on. So we're trying to kind of cut through and be like the civic engagement mission of focusing on political knowledge and objective reality in the ages of disinformation. So in terms of our roadmap, we're hoping to be kind of releasing Horse Race out into the world in the new year. That's like the goal. So we may be reappearing and doing the rounds. I feel like we're movie stars when a movie is about to come out. We're going to go around and do a bunch of interviews and tell people all about Horse Race. But that's coming down the line. So yeah, as Matt says, we're working with Focus Games at the moment, who are fantastic. They're amazing colleagues. And it's so great when you actually go to an institution or an organization where people actually know what they're doing and everyone seems like happy to be there and not in some kind of existential crisis either.
Yeah, we didn't have a single financial update when we were visiting them.
It's very nice. They don't really talk about money. They just get the job done. But yeah, so the goal is to, we're currently working on this new iteration of Horse Race, which is, if I do say so myself, a way better looking version than previous iterations with many more features and nicer UI. And hopefully by kind of January time, we'll be rolling out to the public ahead of the Senate elections next year.
Yeah, I think essentially I'm going to be hosting a lot of sessions where people are making forecasts of the Welsh election. So any guest lectures that I'm invited to give, even to Swedish students, that's forced to forecast the Welsh election.
Everyone has to use Horse Race. It's the caveat of our appearance.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, let's see what happens with the election, but I'd love to connect afterwards and hear what the outcome of that for your research has been. So, Professor Wall, Dr. Bromfield, thanks so much for taking the time out and discussing forecasting with us.
Jochen Bauer.
Thank you for having us. That's the English translation.
I've just been speaking with Professor Matthew Wall and Dr. Louis Bromfield, who are at the Department of Politics, Philosophy, and International Relations at Swansea University. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'm going to do an episode on teaching political communication and introduce some workshop-type activities that are good not only for the classroom, but also for professionals. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Pacetta, signing off from Elba. See you next time.